everyone, and welcome back to our lecture series on understanding literary criticism and theories for preparing for next examination. Let us revise on what we have been discussing so far in our lecture series, very particularly, by the way. We have started talking about the modern period of literary criticism. As I stated very previously during our one of the lecture series, talking about the study of literary criticism, by the way. I told you that every period of the literary criticism or the revolutionary period of that remarks a kind of a great amount of history in English literature. It remains one of the significant factor to understand the role of that period, and it has laid some or the other way kind of a foundation for the further period. So in a way, we find that this period remains very interesting in a way, and each period has a significance. Now, while talking about the development of literary criticism and the evolution of various literary critical ideas, thought process, and the very formulations in the course of time, they have been in a very interesting way. And so their advancement in its form or in shaping the ideas exactly in very in every period of the time, in every period of this literary criticism, we find that this literature has got developed in a different way. And so this matters the most otherwise, right? Where we have to understand the significance of the very particular period that we are focusing on. And when it comes to deal with something like literary criticism in English literature, very particularly, guys, in the modern period, we find which is a kind of a vibrant period actually compared to the Victorian period or a neoclassical period or in a way restoration period or in a way which we can say also the neoclassical or Renaissance period or the Old English or also can be called the classical period of English literary criticism. Now the whole journey of the criticism that in a way commenced from Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and their further predecessors who were there in the history of literary criticism in English literature particularly and across the globe. The influence of various amount of literary figures that would take place could be seen very notably with the modulation or the shaping of literary criticism in the very in the very course of time, and thus it remains very much important and significant to understand what different ideologies got greatly evolved and how those ideologies were greatly applied otherwise, right? And taking this into completely consideration, it is a much more of an interest to understand how this literature and the literary criticism had parallelly gone together in the process of development and has evolved in the course of time, right? And so it is much more of an importance to understand how significantly those ideologies terminologies have been developed. Now when we talk about literary criticism and theories, guys, by the way, guys, we have talked about the method of my carrying out my method of going on with those ideas and explaining with you and discussing with you is that I have been talking about the very particular period, and then also we have been talking about the importance of that period in the very course of time, right? So, whichever period we pick up, we try to understand what were the social, political, economical, and cultural factors that have influenced the shaping of critical ideas in the very particular period. Then we also have talked about characteristics of that very particular period, which has influenced the production of literary text and the literary figures or literary genres that got produced, right? Apart from that, now keeping the NET and SET examination into consideration, it is much more important to have the vast kind of a knowledge about those very particular period people. When you talk about those very particular period and the contribution of the literary figures that existed in that very particular period, I think it is much more of a importance to have a clear idea of how these periods otherwise leave a kind of an indelible impact on the further literature that got produced. Now, as we have seen, the kind of a legacy directly or indirectly carried forward by those very particular figures that got kind of a great prominence due to their work in those very particular period, we find that their existence and their explanation of various ideas is notably been taken over there. The references are yet there. Exactly, though they have come up with something new in a way, we can find that what had been already discussed in the ancient time or in the old period has been discussed in the present time also or in that very particular contemporary period, but in a different way. Exactly, the version or the way might be quite different in case of understanding to those ideas. But I would say that while preparing for those NET set examination, it is a much more of an importance to have those identifications with us that have in a way influenced the process of shaping the literary criticism and the foundation of literary criticism in the very particular period. So I was telling you about the methodology that I have been following while discussing with you about various literary periods and the criticism that got developed in the very particular period. Guys, that we talk about the period Then we talk about the characteristics of the very particular period, and also we try to find out what different factors were there that have influenced. And so we have studied about the classical period, neoclassical period, Renaissance period, Restoration period, Puritan period, exactly the Puritan age, the age of Augustine. Then we talked about neoclassical ideas, and the emergence of romantic movement otherwise, right? Likewise, there are several other movements also which are very much significant in the very particular period, right? So when you talk about those very periods and those very interesting ideologies, I think it is much more of a importance to have this kind of a patience with us, where we are able to discuss in detail about those interesting factors otherwise that have been influencing the literary figures and the prominent poets and critics all together, right? Some of them, in a great way, also are the literary monks. They have produced their own literature, so they have talked about the literature that got produced in the period in a critical angle and in an analytical way. But in a way, we have seen them practicing their own ideas in a very significant way. So it is a much more of an importance to have a clear look at their work and understand what they have been talking so far, right? And going back to what we have been discussing in the previous lecture, guys, we have started talking about the modern period of literary criticism, right? It's I think it's our third lecture that we are talking about the modern period of literary criticism. Now, in the very initial way, we have talked about the characteristics of modern period, and also we have seen the various factors that have shaped the modern period of literary criticism. Particularly, it is much more of importance, I would say, to understand in what sense we have realized that the significance of this modern period of literary criticism has remarked an indelible impact on the history of English literary criticism, right? Now, it was not just in case of literary criticism, but the entire literature that got produced can be seen vastly, influenced by the modern thoughts, modern ideologies that have newly emerged. Now, we also talked about what were the factors that have influenced the process of shaping of literary critical ideologies in the modern period. Now, when we talk about those factors that have influenced the shaping of this literary figure, we have to keep in mind that in a very interesting way, it is of a much more importance to have this idea, right? That the social factor, the political factor, the cultural factor, and definitely the the advancement of technology, industrialization. So many factors are there which have shaped. Now, as we say, literature is nothing but the lifelike representation of a society. How society functions is been reflected in the literature that gets produced. So, poetry also has a subject matter from the society itself, or it is the highest amount of appealing factor to the human intelligence or human mind particularly, right? So what appeals to your mind is definitely existing in the poetry, and is it a representation of society? Okay, now taking this into consideration, I think it is much more of importance. So taking all those things, rather just pre-assuming them, we also have seen notably about those very works very interestingly, right? And so it is of a much more importance to have a very clear idea about those ideologies and those factors that influence the strategy of this very particular period. So we talked about now, when we talk about the commencement of modern period, it's a time span that covers from the first, beginning of 20th century, the mid 19th, 20th century, and after on we have this new ideologies that got developed, something like a new criticism, structuralism, post-structuralism, exactly, are the some of the outcomes of the thought process that got started in the modern period very particularly. So it is of a much more importance to have look at those very interesting factors that have played a crucial role in shaping the critical ideas, thoughts in the modern period. Scientific inventions were there, technological advancements were there, and also medical advancements. Okay, the advancement in the field of medication also can be seen making an impact. Now, two major factors of the modern period are the world wars. First World War and Second World War, which leaves an indelible impact. Also, we have talked about that, how it had shaped the thought of alienation, exactly, and unemployment, displacement, then insecurity, the impact on health, economy, all those factors as they influence very much social strata. Literature is not inseparable from society, exactly, it is an inseparable part of society. So it also impacted literature and literary criticism, exactly. So when you try to find out the advancement in scientific, as many scientific experiments have taken place, a kind of a similar factor we can also see with, somewhere it started, it laid a foundation, the thoughts, exactly. When we try to trace the the commencement of the thoughts that got developed in the modern period, and we try to track, we try to find out the trail of those thoughts. We can go back to the romantic period of literary criticism, exactly. So the scientific advancement, somewhere luxury, capitalism, all sort of things were there, in a way, which have shaped the Victorian period, the criticism in Victorian period very particularly. And likewise we find it's in a way, otherwise also influencing people, the ideas that got framed in modern period particularly, right? So it is much more of a importance to have a look at those very interesting factors, keeping the NATE and SET examination into our eyes, in front of your eyes and in front of our vision, right? And now talking about how those, those factors particularly and ideologies. Now we have got somebody like Matthew Arnold. Yesterday also we talked about him and how his ideas in a way otherwise have influenced. He's considered as a bridge, figure. Exactly, bridge figure means he and his thoughts are greatly influenced the modern critics to otherwise to understand whatever modern thoughts were there. His touchstone method, his discussion on functions of criticism in the real time or in the present time, exactly, and his idea of referring to the classical works of the previous. So his a list that he has provided, that whom should be referred, like Dante, Homer, then Milton, then we have got somebody like Shakespeare. So a number of prominent figures are there according to Arnold, who should be referred when somebody is willing to come up with his own expressions and willing to put them into a literary genre otherwise, whether it's a poetry, fiction, or drama, any of that, but it has to be taken into consideration very in an interesting way otherwise, right? Now taking this whole of introduction, now let us revise about what we have been discussing, since past time, about the various literary figures that got otherwise, right? So it is much more of importance to have a look at those very interesting ideologies that we have been discussing so far. Now, in yesterday's lecture, we talked about I.A. Richards, then we talked about T.S. Eliot also, I.A. Richards, then we talked about Clement Brooks, then we talked about the commencement of new criticism, what were the thought processes that got developed in new criticism. Then we talked about few of the terminologies that have been developed. Exactly, we talked about irony, we talked about paradox, we talked about motivation, we talked about tension, we talked about the some interesting factors that have, we talked about ambiguity, the several types of ambiguity that have been discussed, and how ambiguity takes place about the literature. Exactly. Now we can see the advancement in, in another way. The linguistic approach of finding the meaning of a text could be seen greatly introduced in the modern period only, and its rigorous efforts or endeavors could be seen taken by those modern critics, particularly in case of defining the meanings of text, exactly, right? So there is much of importance given to the form instead of the content, and how content itself gets fit into the form, and then in an amalgamation of this results into the perfect meaning of the text, which results into highest amount of appealing factor in case of experiencing the literature that we have been reading. Now, taking all those things into consideration, people, it is much more of an importance, as I have been repeating, for several times, that how this influences the factor of understanding the literary criticism and its factors particularly. I would say that it is much more of importance. So we have talked about those things. Let us move with what we have been talking so far about the further parts, and the in a way, advanced versions of those identities in a way, right? So in a way, much more important to understand how significantly they can be discussed otherwise, right? Now talking about the various factors that we have been discussing since last few lectures, let us continue with what we have been discussing, right? So just to sum up with what we have been discussing so far, we talked about intentional fallacy, right? Which got kind of a greater amount of importance in our discussion particularly, and now we are going to talk about the archetypal criticism particularly. Now what is archetypal criticism particularly? The term archetype denotes to the recurrent narrative designs, patterns of actions, character types, themes, and images that are identifiable in a wide variety of works of literature, as well as myths, dreams, and even social rituals. Exactly. So, the narrative designs, exactly, then patterns of actions, then character types, then the themes, then the images that are identifiable. Exactly. It means you have got something assimilated. You go to watch a movie and you try to assimilate with the pain or suffering or the merriment situations that have been introduced in a particular movie. Exactly. So it is a part of script only. So what is going in the script is been performed by on the in the film only, and we can see that. Likewise, the assimilating factors can be seen in the literature, and they are identifiable in a wide variety of works of literature, as well as myths, dreams, and even in social rituals. So such a recurrent items are usually held to be the result of elemental and universal patterns in the human psyche, and so two important Antecedents to the archetypal criticism are James Frazer's The Golden Box and Carl Jung's concept of depth of psychology. Now we find, in a way where we find them, identifying the elemental patterns of myth and rituals that recur in the legends and ceremonials of diverse and far-flung cultures, exactly, and religions. So he applied the term archetype to primordial images, the psychic residue of repeated patterns of experiences in our very ancient ancestors which survive in the collective unconscious of the human race and are expressed in myths, religions, dreams, and private fantasies, as well as in works of literature. Exactly. So those are the elements which we find assimilating some or the other way, or we have got references to them, or they're already existing, or can be seen, experienced in a particular way. Now, when we talk about those references which are very much significant people, I think it is much more of importance to have this kind of a significant, identification with us to realize this archetypal criticism. What it says that it is the psychic residue, exactly, it is one of the remnant factor, exactly, of a repeated patterns of experience in our very ancient ancestors which survive in the collective unconscious of human race and are expressed in the myths, religion, dreams, and private fantasies, as well as in the works of literature. So those experiences, those ideas are already been conceiving, okay, like they have been already existing since past times with from our ancestors only, and they are carried through the hereditary factors or through genes in a way, and so their functioning is already fixed in our brain, which we really realize somewhere. We consider the deja vu also when we realize that, yeah, I have already experienced something like this, and so understanding of this in a way makes kind of a greater sense. Now, archetypal criticism is given something, impetus by Maud Bodking's archetypal patterns in poetry, and also we have got G. Wilson Knight, Robert Graves and Philip Wilbright, then Richard Chase and Leslie Fielder and Joseph Campbell and Northrop Fryer, right? So these are the prominent figures who have prominently given a contribution in archetypal criticism. Now, what is it that these critics assume that myths are closer to the elemental archetype? Now, they are not artful manipulations of writers. The death rebirth theme is treated as the archetype of the archetypes, and it is based on the cycle of the seasons and that of a human life, exactly. So when a literature that has something mythological references, or in a way a myth that has been discussed or in a way covered, we realize that its significance is much more of importance, and so archetype people in a way assume to that this is something, in a way which can be taken into consideration for understanding of its literary figure and literary value. So the criticism is in a way somehow associated with those factors, right? Now, in a remarkable book on anatomy of criticism, Northrop Frye developed the archetypal approach. Now, according to Frye, the totality of literary works constitutes a self-contained literary universe which has been created over ages by the human imagination to assimilate the alien and indifferent world of nature into archetypal forms that satisfy enduring human desires and needs. Okay, now let's break into the very different sentences, particularly what it has to state. Right, he says that, right, the totality of literature, the wholeness of literature, frames, constitute means it builds, exactly what it builds, a self-contained literary universe. It has its literary universe. Okay, the whole literature has its literary universe. Okay, now this universe has been created over ages. Now this universe that they create, exactly, or they form, is already created ages before, right? The human imagination to assimilate the alien and indifferent world of nature. Exactly, everything that we experience is something new or some or the other way indifferent to us. But when it comes to assimilate with that, we realize that yes, something this has ever before experienced, right? And so through experiences, those experiences are recorded, into our mind directly or indirectly, and so they become conscious or sometimes subconscious part of our storage. And definitely, this some or the other way assimilating factors are there which allow us to have the clear identification of those factors that we come across. So he says that they are the nature into archetypal forms and that satisfy enduring human desires and needs. So in this literary universe, four radical uh, myths corresponding to the four seasons in the cycle of the natural world are incorporated in the four major genres of comedy, that is spring, romance as a summer, tragedy as a autumn, and satire as a winter. So this seasoning has been done over here by him, right? Now, in a way, this is how we go on discussing about the archetypal criticism. Now we have got some interesting factors, in a way that talk about the what we say, in a way they talk about the significant realization of those interesting factors. So we have got some Indian contributory part also, in which we realize that. Now let us talk about some interesting movements that play a kind of a key role in case of understanding the literary uh, criticism otherwise. Now, the literary movements that are way of looking at the delimiting the total scenario of literary by categorizing, the similarities and enumerating differences. Other methods of these classifications are those based on the historical periods and genres. So we have been already through the understanding of those various factors. Now, when we talk about those literary movements, those are the various periods that have covered. Again, as I said, considering romanticism and classicism or neoclassicism more of as a period, is actually it remains a movement. Because why it is a movement? Because some prominent figures in that very particular period, somebody like, when you talk about neoclassicism, we have got somebody like Aristotle, Alexander Pope, or somebody like a John Dryden is there, or also we've got somebody like a John Benson. Okay, so he says in a way, Ben Jonson, who says that in a way that this is much more of importance to have this clear ideological thought process, that it is not something that is to be brought in a remarkable way, right? In a way, whatever ideologies they develop with, whatever critical ideologies they develop with, it is after, it is developed after a rigorous kind of an endeavor that they have been through, and so their outcome is something that we today read as a particular period of history, right? So thus this contribution remains very significant, in case of the process of shaping the literary genres that got greatly published in those very period. And so notably they are called as a movement, exactly, and not just labelized as a period in history, right? So they do not just only experience or witness something like the change, exactly, but they are actively taking part in those periods, exactly. And so they are not just only labelized classicism or neoclassicism or romanticism just only the period, but they are the great movements in which those figures or the period, people in that contemporary periods can be seen actively involved, and exactly making some or the other way kind of a contribution which would, enhance the taste of literature or the understanding of literary criticism and the critical ideologies, right? So it is much more of an importance to have this kind of a very interesting look at those periods people, to realize that how significantly we can move on with the understanding of those periods, right? And so I would say that it is much more of a greater importance to realize the significant factors. So let us move on and understand what is there in the classical period particularly, right? So it both is an art style and as the first theory of art that was defined by the ancient Greeks, which emulated by the Romans and then continued to appear in the various forms across the centuries. Historically, this period is mostly associated with the classicism, is the 5th and 4th century BC in Greece, with writers such as Aristotle, exactly, and Sophocles, the 1st century BC and 1st century AD, Rome, with writers like Cicero and Virgil, and in late 17th century French drama, and in the 18th century especially the France during the period called the Enlightenment. Now in those various periods the references of classical ideologies can be notably seen otherwise, right? And they remain a kind of like a significant factor in case of understanding their roles and their contribution particularly, right? Now, when we talk about some prominent figures like a Voltaire and Condorcet, exactly, and its varying formulations like classicism affirms the superiority of balance and rationality over impulse emotions, right? And so it aspires to formal precision, affirms order, and eschews, ambiguity, flights of imagination, or lack of resolution. So it asserts the importance of wholeness and unity. The work of art coheres without extraneous elements or open-ended conclusions. Now, when you talk about the significance, now we have been discussing about the prominently this para describes the characteristics of this period, the classical movement particularly, which emphasized on particular forms, its a completeness, its a wholeness, the unity of. So we have been discussing about the two prominent unities that are yet been discussed by those prominent figures very particularly, right? Because those periods and those prominent movements that took place are very much significant, because so when we find somebody like Aristotle talking about the unities, so the wholeness can be seen with this literary figures or literary genres, which are quite important otherwise to understand, right? Moving forward, we have that this classicism had a strong influence in Europe, especially in France and in England in the 17th and 18th centuries. We have got somebody like Ben Jonson, Dryden, Pope, Swift, Addison, and Dr. Johnson were the followers of classicism in English literature. And so this period when these great figures lived in is called as neoclassical. Now when we studied about the emergence of neoclassical ideologies and neoclassicism, we also have come across the very interesting factor that some people like Jonathan Swift or Alexander Pope, or in a way John Dryden, have been there, who said that there is a much more importance of bringing back the classical ideas and referring to the classical rules that were discussed by the classical scholars from Greek, Roman, and Latin background, very interestingly, right? And somehow we can see the influence of those classical writers can be notably observed with, or witnessed with the practice by those prominent figures. Now, when we talk about the work of John Dryden or Alexander Pope or in a way Ben Jonson's, they do not only remain as a significant factor, right? As a literary critical figure, okay, they are not the critics particularly, right? Not just only critics, but they are also the practical, people who have experienced or witnessed their own thoughts through their works, exactly, or presented their thoughts, and so the society has witnessed quite well about their work. And so we find them, much of so we find in them there are much of longing for the classical thoughts and classical ideologies, and so we find them implementing the same. Definitely what classicals have discussed in the period is notably applicable to their very interesting form for sure. But what those have greatly observed and insisted the observance of classical notions in the 17th and 18th century can be seen implementing the upgraded version of their classical thoughts. So I think it is much more of an importance to have this very interesting look at the thought process that has been got developed, okay, exactly. And thus the classical movement remains very significant because it has its a lasting impact. It was not just only till the 17th and 18th century, but we can see its impact in the 19th and 20th century also, where those modern poets and modern figures of literary criticism, referring to what Aristotle had said, what Plato had said, or referring to those ideas that were been discussed, right? Now, in the 20th century, there has been a considerable revival of interest in classical themes in drama, fiction, and verse, especially in French drama and particularly in the plays of Sartre. Exactly, we have got John Paul Sartre, who talks about the realism and considered one of the prominent figures. Then we have got Cocteau, then Gaddox, and Anolio. The modern literary critics like Matthew Arnold and T.S. Eliot were ardent followers of classical writers and advocated for virtues like adherence to the form and rules and austerity and detachment in treatment. So, when we try to understand the significance of this very interesting factor, exactly, it is much more of importance to have the look at those ideas that have been greatly discussed, right? So again, as I said, the classicism does not exist only in 4th and 3rd century BC, right? Third century, 4th and 3rd century BC, but it existed, it has its a lasting impact, as that's why they are called as classicals. Exactly, they are not only referred in the very particular period of time, but they are yet referred by many great scholars and critics in their upcoming period also, right? And thus those movements remain very much significant to be taken into consideration. Moving forward, which says is the neoclassicism. Now, neoclassicism, also spelled as a neoclassicism, was a Western culture movement in the decorative and visual arts, literature, theater, music, and architecture that drew inspiration from the art and culture of classical antiquity. Exactly, what were the notions, rules, principles, ethical factors were discussed by the ancient classicals. Their, those thoughts, those things could be brought back because exactly as it was much more necessary to restore the same quality in the artwork that got produced in the contemporary period was taken into consideration as a part of great concern otherwise, and so we find them greatly discussed otherwise, both those prominent figures. So it is, I think it is much more of an importance to have the look at those very interesting factors that we come across discussing, right? And so this neoclassical ideology particularly discusses about those interesting factors. So let's go and further and just try to understand what it still talks about. Yes. So the neoclassical period in English literature span across more than a century from 1660 to 1785. The year 1660 marks the return of the monarchy after the short interval of Puritan regime, right, in England, and in 1784 a memorable as the year of Dr. Johnson's death. It was a period of revival of classicism in literature, and while the movement is often described as the opposed counterpart of Romanticism, this is a great oversimplification that tends not to be sustainable when specific artists of works are considered, right? And so we have got this very brief background, just a summarizing background of what we have been discussing in the very interesting period, that is neoclassical period. But it is much more of an importance to have the look at those ideas that have been discussed in this period, right? This period, which spans more than a century, particularly remains a remarkable period in history of English literary criticism. And thus it is much more of importance to have a look at those interesting factors that we go on discussing when we try to focus on this period, right? And so though it is in a way considered as a counterpart to Romanticism, okay, or in a way it laid kind of a foundation to bring the romantic ideas or commencement of romantic movement in the history of English literature, right? It is not just only this kind of a part that it has played role in English literary criticism particularly, but it has something more and beyond the thinking capacity that it has given to the English literary period. So let's go and try to understand. Now we have got some prominent figures like neoclassical writers modeled their works on classical text and followed various aesthetic values first established in ancient Greece and Rome. Now in this very moment, the authors and writers who were there, they prominently focused a lot on in a way understanding of the literary figures and referring to the classical ideologies, right? सो जुन्या क्लासिकल आयडिया ज्या ज्या आहेत त्या सगळ्यांना स्ट्रॉंगली रेफर करणं, त्यांच्याकडे लक्ष देणं आणि त्यातून जे काही ॲस्थेटिक सेन्स असेल, क्वालिटी वर्क असेल जे प्रोड्यूस केलं गेलं होतं किंवा ज्या टेक्निकॅलिटीज वापरल्या होत्या त्या टेक्निकॅलिटीजच्या आधारेच पुन्हा एकदा तशाच प्रकारचं क्लासिकल वर्क प्रोड्यूस करण्यासाठीचा हा एक प्रकारे खटाटोप किंवा एक प्रकारचा चांगला प्रयत्न आपण या ठिकाणी म्हणू शकतो. The 7th century and 18th century neoclassicism was, in a sense, a resurgence of classical taste and sensibility. Exactly. It is not just in hands of the literary figures that have been there. Okay. So it is not just only because of the poets and the writers decide for that. The audience and the readers who have been there also have to have the taste of classical periods particularly, and so their acceptance of having those classical ideas matter the most. And so we can see in a way it is a resurgence of ब्रिंगिंग बॅक द क्लासिकल नोशन, म्हणजे पुन्हा एकदा जे क्लासिझममध्ये घडलं होतं ते सगळं पुन्हा एकदा या ठिकाणी आणायचं आणि त्यानुसार आपलं पुढची कार्यवाही चालू ठेवायची, अशा प्रकारचा एक प्रकार या ठिकाणी तर न्यू क्लासिकल पिरियडमध्ये केलेला दिसतो. इन पार्ट ॲज अ रिॲक्शन टू द बोल्ड egocentrism of the Renaissance that saw man as a larger than life and boundless in potential, the neoclassicists directed their attention to a smaller scale concept of a man as an individual within a larger social context, seeing human nature as a dualistic, flawed, and needing to be curbed by reason and decorum. Right. So when we talk about Renaissance, that is quite previous to classical or neoclassical thoughts, where man became the center of everything and it became the most intelligent personality or the most powering or dominating kind of a characterization. सो हे जे लेबलायझेशन झालं होतं ना माणसाचं, की माणूस या सगळ्याचा सेंटर आहे आणि माणूस या सगळ्याचं महत्त्व आहे, कुठेतरी या जगामध्ये माणूस अतिशय छोटा आहे हे सांगण्याचं काम आणि हे लॉजिक आणि रिझन याच्या बेसवर एक्सप्लेन करण्याचं काम कुठेतरी केलेलं दिसतं. ते कुठे केलं गेलं तर तो थॉट पाडून काढण्याचं एक वेगळं नरेटिव्ह उभं करण्याचं काम कुठे केलेलं दिसतं. तर वी कॅन नोटीस दिस डिफरंट नरेटिव्ह दॅट गॉट ग्रेटली डेव्हलप इन particularly this neoclassical period. And so it says, in a part, as a reaction to the bold egocentrism of Renaissance that saw man as larger than life and boundless in potential. Right? It was a reaction to the so again, as I stated, very strongly, or as I have been stating very strongly in all of my lectures, that when we study particularly every interesting period, right, in a way it has some its remnants in the previous period, and also they leave their remnants in the upcoming period. सो जेव्हा कुठे आपण एखाद्या पर्टिक्युलर हिस्टॉरिकल पिरियडचा अभ्यास करतो ना, तेव्हा याची काही धागेदोरे आपल्याला मागच्या पिरियडमध्ये सापडतात किंवा मागच्या पिरियडमधल्या काही गोष्टींमुळे या नवीन पिरियडची सुरुवात किंवा नवीन थॉट प्रोसेसची सुरुवात झालेली दिसते आणि म्हणून मग याचे इम्पॅक्ट पुढच्यावरही दिसतात. एक्झॅक्टली. अँड सो दिस कुड बी सीन. सो इट वॉज जस्ट काइंड ऑफ लाईक in a way, the extremism in Renaissance thoughts could be seen. The outcome, is an out neoclassicism is an outcome of that thought process, particularly can be seen, and so Romanticism is outcome of extremism in neoclassical thought process, right? And so the extremism of Romanticism could be seen in Victorian period, and so the hype of Victorian thoughts could be resulted into modern period, right? सो इन अ वे त्याचं प्रत्येक ठिकाणी अपडेटेड व्हर्जन समोरासमोर येत राहताना दिसतं, राईट. Moving forward, what it says is that in style, neoclassicists continued the Renaissance value of balanced antithesis, symmetry, restraint, and order. Additionally, they tried to seek to achieve a sense of refinement, good taste, and correctness. Okay, so we find Alexander Pope talking about using wit, following the rules, being in the form, exactly, referring to the talking about the nature, exactly. So many things are there that we have discussed in our previous lectures too when we talked about the prominent figures in the neoclassical period, and so this is also one of the qualities of this very period. The neoclassicists sought to imitate the classics, looking to the poetic conventions, the dramatic theories, as well as the rhetorical skills of the classes as models. So जे जे काही क्लासेस लोकांनी तयार केलं होतं त्या सगळ्यांकडे एक मॉडेल म्हणून बघणं, एक्झॅक्टली referring to those things as a model and trying to understand and accordingly producing a literature based on those. So it was just nothing like a copying what the classicals have been doing. एक्झॅक्टली क्लासिकल्स लोकांनी जे केलंय तशाच गोष्टी तितक्या स्ट्रॉंगली छापणं किंवा तशा प्रकारचं काम या ठिकाणी आपण केलेलं बघू शकतो. अँड दस इट इज मच मोर ऑफ अ इम्पॉर्टन्स टू हॅव अ काइंड ऑफ अ ग्रेट लुक ॲट दोज व्हेरी इंटरेस्टिंग फॅक्टर्स व्हेरी पर्टिक्युलरली टू हॅव अ काइंड ऑफ अ क्लिअर लुक. तर ते समजून घेणं फार महत्त्वाचं आहे. ओके, पुढे काय बघा. फ्रॉम द ऑनसेट ऑफ द रेस्टोरेशन एज थ्रू द एज ऑफ जॉन्सन, writers imitated classical forms such as the ode, the satire, and the epic. अगदी रेस्टोरेशन पिरियडमध्ये सुद्धा काही लोकांनी या सगळ्याचं कुठे ना कुठेतरी एक प्रकारे इमिटेशन केलेलं दिसतं किंवा एक प्रकारे या सगळ्यांचा ऑब्झर्वन्स केलेला दिसतो की जो अत्यंत महत्त्वाचा आहे किंवा समजून घेणं फार गरजेचं आहे, राईट. मग कोण कोण आहे? जॉन ड्रायडन. दे ऑल्सो टेंडेड टू फेवर राइम्ड couplets utilizing conventional poetic diction and imaginary in their works. You've got John Dryden, Alexander Pope, Dr. Johnson, Jonathan Swift, Joseph Addison, Richard Steele, Henry Fielding, Oliver Goldsmith, and Edward Gibson. Exactly, were some of the neoclassical writers in the English literature. Right? Then we have got Romanticism. We are looking at the literary periods in the point of view of movements now, various literary movements that got emerged in the course of time. ओके, यापूर्वी आपण त्यांचा अभ्यास आपण हिस्टॉरिकल पिरियड्स म्हणून केला आहे लिटररी क्रिटिसिझमचा. आता आपण त्यांचं थोडंसं रिव्हिजनरी पार्ट करतो म्हणजे काय तर मुवमेंट म्हणून, आणि मग ते संपलं की आपण आजच्या लेक्चरमध्ये एक क्वेश्चन आयर तयार केलेल्या ज्या MCQ टाईप क्वेश्चन्सला आपण आजच्या या लेक्चर सिरीजमध्ये सॉल्व करणार आहोत, राईट. अँड वी आर गोइंग टू गो थ्रू इट वन बाय वन व्हेरी पर्टिक्युलरली. Next we have is Romanticism. It is a literary movement spanning roughly from 1790 to 1850, a time span of almost 60 years or 6 decades. The movement was characterized by the celebration of nature and the common man, a focus on individual experience, an idealization of woman, and an embrace of isolations and melancholy. These are the various characteristics of this Romanticism. कॉमन मॅनला व्हॅल्यू होती, एक्झॅक्टली. इंडिव्हिज्युअल एक्सपिरियन्सवरती फोकस केलं गेलं, एक्झॅक्टली. वुमन एम्पॉवरमेंट किंवा वुमन ॲडोलेशन झालं. गोईंग क्लोज टू द नेचर वॉज ऑल्सो अ ग्रेटर पार्ट, अँड दे एम्ब्रेस्ड आयसोलेशन अँड मेलनकली. दुःख सुद्धा असतं आयुष्यामध्ये आणि दुःखाला सुद्धा आपण तितकंच छानपणे बघितलं पाहिजे असं त्या प्रकारचं एक महत्त्व. म्हणजे सामान्य माणसाच्या आयुष्यात जसं सगळं असतं. प्रॉमिनंट रोमॅन्टिक रायटर्स इन्क्लूड जॉन कीट्स, William Wordsworth, P.B. Shelley, then Shelley, Mary Shelley, the term romanticism does not stem directly from the concept of love, but rather than from the French word romance, which means a romantic story told in verse, right? And so, romanticism focused on emotions and their inner life of the writer, exactly, and the inner life of the writer, and often used autobiographical material to inform the work of or even to provide a template for it, unlike traditional literature at the time, right? आणि सो इन अ वे त्या लिटररी कॉन्टेक्स्टमध्ये जे जे काही घडतं त्या सगळ्यामध्ये कॉमन लोकांच्या आयुष्यामध्ये जे काही महत्त्वाचं आहे, गोईंग क्लोज टू द नेचर, सिलेक्टिंग टॉपिक्स फ्रॉम दोज थिंग्स, एक्झॅक्टली, अँड नाव हॅव्हिंग बेट ऑफ ऑटोबायोग्राफिकल टच, त्या रायटरच्या लाईफमध्ये असणारे एक्सपिरियन्सेस, त्याच्या इनर लाईफमध्ये घडणाऱ्या गोष्टी, या सगळ्याचं विश्लेषणात्मक स्पष्टीकरण, एक्झॅक्टली द क्रिटिकल अनालिसिस आणि its interpretation could be greatly noticed with those period particularly, and so this period remains one of the interesting factor people to understand, right? And so this is about the literary figure which remains very significant and interesting otherwise. Romanticism also fixed, Romanticism celebrated the primitive and elevated regular people as being deserving of celebration, which was an innovation at the time. म्हणजे इथल्या कॉमन लोकांना, सामान्य लोकांना जितकं महत्त्व आहे तितकंच महत्त्व जगातल्या सगळ्या लोकांना आहे. त्यामुळे त्यांच्याबद्दल सुद्धा आपण बोललं गेलं पाहिजे. जे गावाकडे राहणारे लोक आहेत, द पीपल लिव्हिंग ॲट द कंट्री साईड, पीपल लिव्हिंग इन द विलेजेस अँड द काइंड ऑफ लाईफ दे आर लिडिंग, कॉमन पीपल, exactly, not just people living in a village otherwise, but common people, normal people, like a paper seller, or in a way chimney sweeper, or just somebody who does a kind of a labor work, is also a kind of somebody who deserves to be a subject matter of a poetry or literary context in a way, and taking that into consideration. So these regular people deserve the celebration, and so they should be taken into consideration. And so something this was considered quite innovative when this was brought into the discussion, in the mainstream discussion, right? Moving forward, romanticism also fixated on nature as a primordial force and encouraged the concept of isolation as necessary for spiritual and artistic development. Re-originated in tranquility. Exactly. We can see it's a thought greatly conceived in the very ideology that re-originated in tranquility, where it says isolation and peace to achieve the spiritual and artistic characteristics, particularly achievements. So the artistic sense, spiritual sense डेव्हलप करत असेल तर आयसोलेशन हवं आणि शांतता हवी, ही सगळ्यात महत्त्वाची आहे असं या काळातल्या क्रिटिक्सनी प्रॉमिनंटली डिस्कस केलेलं दिसतं, किंवा रोमॅन्टिक्सनी डिस्कस केलेलं दिसतं. द रोमॅन्टिक लिटरेचर इज मार्क्ड बाय 6 प्रायमरी कॅरेक्टरिस्टिक्स: द celebration of nature, focus on individual and spirituality, a celebration of isolation and melancholy, interest in the common man, idealization of woman, and personification and pathetic fallacy. Romanticism continues to influence literature today. Stephanie Meyer says Twilight novels are clear descendants of the movement, incorporating most of the characteristics of classic romanticism, despite being published a century and a half after the end of the movement's active life. खरं तर ही जेव्हा मुवमेंट संपुष्टात आली त्यानंतर सुद्धा याचे अनेक चाहते होते, अनेक लोक याला स्ट्रॉंगली फॉलो करणारे होते, ज्यांनी त्यांच्या पुढच्या लाईफमध्ये या सगळ्या गोष्टींना अतिशय स्ट्रॉंगली फॉलो केलेलं आपण यामध्ये ओळखू शकतो, राईट? अँड सो इट इज मच मोर ऑफ इम्पॉर्टन्स टू have the understanding of those interesting factors too. Moving forward, we have got humanism, right? What is humanism? It is a system of education and mode of inquiry that originated in northern Italy during the 13th and 14th centuries and later spread through the continental Europe and England. This term is alternatively applied to a variety of Western beliefs, methods, and philosophies that place eternal emphasis on human realm. This humanism can be said as a belief in a value. It is a belief in a value, freedom, and independence of human beings. Exactly. And for a humanist or the proponent of humanism, all human beings are born with moral values and have a responsibility to help one another live better life. Exactly. and that's what the humanist people think, that everybody is blessed with some kind of a moral value, and that is there existing in them by birth, and so this allows them to help each other for the better human life, surviving, continuing with a better human life. So humanism focuses on reason and science over scripture, means religious text, and thus tradition, and believes that human beings are flawed but capable of improvement. Exactly. So all the human beings are blessed with some or the other kind of flaws, but they can overcome those flaws and make an improvement in their performance as a human being in all arenas of life. Further, we have is somebody like German scholars to designate the Renaissance and emphasis on classical studies in education, which they called Renaissance humanism. The word acquired an ideological overtone after an anonymous French essayist used it to denote a general love of humanity. ह्युमनिझम रेनेसन्स ह्या शब्दाला महत्व आलं कारण त्याने जनरल लॉ ऑफ ह्युमॅनिटी डिस्क्राईब करण्यासाठी यातला जो काही रेफरन्स वापरला होता तो त्यावरून. Fine. Moving forward, we have the word humanism and related terms frequently applied to modern doctrines and techniques that are based on the uh, centrality of human experience. In the 20th century, the pragmatic humanism of Ferdinand C.S. Schiller, the criticism humanism of Jacques Maritain, and the movement known as secular humanism, though differing from each other significantly in content, all showed this anthropocentric emphasis. So, humanism has been the inspiration for countless works of literature and art, and so it's a kind of a great creative writing classes. Further, we have is realism. After realism, we have naturalism. After naturalism, we have symbolism, and after symbolism, we have got some again prominent factors, that is mimesis, catharsis, literary concepts, negative capability, and then something like right, yeah, the references, right. So we will be continuing with what we have been discussing so far, right. We talked about classicism, we have talked about neoclassicism, right. Now we are supposed to begin with realism. Hello and good evening. Welcome back to our lecture series on literary criticism and understanding the literary terminologies, critical theories, and prominent critical figures in history of English literary criticism. Wise. We are talking about now the various movements that have shaped the literary criticism, and we are going to commence with realism. Now, in the previous, so far, we have talked about the various modern periods, various prominent figures in modern periods. We also have talked about the significance of those interesting periods and how they have been the greatest amount of years that we have been discussing so far. And let us continue with realism. Now, what is realism talks? What realism talks about? It is a movement in art and literature that began in 19th century as a shift against the exotic and poetic conventions of romanticism existing, believing in reality now. According to M. H. Abrams, literary critics apply the term in two distinct ways. The one to identify a 19th century movement in the writing of novels included Honor de Balzac in France, George Eliot in England, and William Dean Howells in America. And second is to designate a recurrent mode in various eras and literary forms of representing human life and experiences in literature. So the realistic novel first developed in the 19th century and is the form we associate with the work of writers such as Jane Austen, then Balzac, George Eliot, and Tolstoy. Leo Tolstoy. According to the Bath, uh, the narrative, uh, this is by Roland Barthes. What he says, that narrative or plot of realistic novel is structured around an opening enigma that throws the conventional cultural and signifying practices into disarray. Everything that is real is presented, but definitely something that is conventional, exactly, yes, cultural, uh, in a way, is some or the other way, is put into a disarray, right, in a dysfunctioning mode. Literary realism allowed for a new form of writing in which authors represented reality by portraying everyday experiences of relatable and complex characters as they are in a real life. So we have got some, talking about the real life problems, exactly, criticizing severely the systems that existed. So it can be about the best example can be seen with Henrik Ibsen's the play, very famous one, An Enemy of People, that talks about the real status of society, the corruption, and so many things are there. So they were portraying the everyday experiences, exactly. And so literary realism describes works with relatable and familiar characters. We are able to relate them and we can find them familiar existing in society, and so the settings are accordingly, and plots are centered around society's middle and lower classes. As a maximum amount of people are under these two classes only in society, so they are can be seen greatly portrayed in those realistic plays. And so, as a result of that, the intent of realism developed as a means to tell a story as truthfully and realistically as possible instead of dramatizing or romanticizing it. त्याला रोमॅन्टिसाइज करण्याची ड्रामॅटाइज करण्याची काही गरज नाही. फॅन्सी अप्लाय करण्याची, इमॅजिनेशन अप्लाय करण्याची, जे रिअली दिसतं ते मांडायचं इझिली आणि त्याच्याबद्दल चर्चा करायची. म्हणून त्याचं फार जरा रिलेटिव्हिटी वाढली ना, त्याला रिलेटेबल करता यायला लागलं. So people found it very interesting and noteworthy otherwise. This movement has greatly impacted how authors write and what readers expect from literature. ऑथर लोकांनी काय लिहावं, लोकांना काय हवंय, लोक काय लिहायला मागतात आणि ऑथर लोक काय लिहित आहेत, या सगळ्या गोष्टींचा कन्स्ट्रक्टिव्ह थॉट आलेला दिसतो. Formalism and structuralism attribute the realistic effect to literary conventions and devices inside a work. So, social realism, socialistic realism, magical realism are considered either as a subgenre or offshoots of realism. त्याच्या वेगवेगळ्या फांद्या आणि त्याचे वेगवेगळे काय म्हणतात डायव्हर्टिव्ह मार्क्स आपण असं म्हणू शकतो. फर्दर वी हॅव इज नॅचरलिझम. नॅचरलिझम काय म्हणतं, इट इज अ लिटररी जॉनर that started as a movement in the late 19th century in literature, film, theater, and art. It is time of extreme realism. It was influenced by Darwinism, materialism, and the determinist philosophy of French critic Hippolyte Taine. The term was coined by Émile Zola, an influential French novelist and himself a naturalist. This movement, the naturalism particularly, suggested the roles of family, social conditions, and environment in shaping human character, as they naturally make an impact without fail. Thus, naturalistic writers write stories based on the idea that the environment determines and governs human character. आपल्या अवतीभोवती काय होणार आहे, एक्झॅक्टली माझा स्वभाव कसा असणार आहे, माझं कॅरेक्टर कसं असणार आहे, माझी पर्सनॅलिटी कशी असणार आहे, हे गवर्न करणारी एक सिस्टीम आहे आणि त्या सिस्टीमला काय म्हणतात तर एन्व्हायरमेंट, राईट. आणि ते काय डिफाईन करतं, ह्युमन कॅरेक्टर. So John Steinbeck is somebody as one of the most popular writers coming from the school of American naturalism. He, in his novel The Grapes of Wrath, portrays the Jod family and its a changing environment from the naturalistic point of view. Now, during the Great Depressions in the United States, okay, so he describes the Jod family as an insignificant, instinct bound, and small creatures bound to seek a paradise they might never find. And so the classical, the middle class and typically lower middle class, maximizing their dreams like that only could be seen, and this portrayed something like remains, and very influential otherwise. Both naturalism and realism are literary genres and interlinked. However, there are some differences between them, as naturalists suggest a philosophical pessimism in which writers use scientific techniques to depict the human beings as objective and impartial characters, whereas realism focuses on literary technique. Realism depicts things as they appear, and while naturalism portrays a deterministic view of characters, actions, and life. Naturalism concludes that natural forces predetermine a character's decision, making him or her act in a particular way. This is the thought that naturalistic people believe. Now, what realistic people or realism believes? Realism poses that a decision of a character comes from his response to a certain situation. So in American literature, naturalism had a delayed blooming in the work of Hamlin Garland, then Stephen Crane, Frank Norris, and Jack London, and it reached its peak in art of Theodore Dreiser. Right, Dreiser. Next movement, what quite famous, it's symbolism. It is the late 19th century literary movement centered mostly around the work of poets such as Stephen Malam, Arthur Rimbaud, Paul Verlaine, Philip Velleries, the Leslie Adam, and the later Maurice Maeterlinck, as well as novelists like Joris Karl Huysmans and Edward Dujardin. Now, this Tristan Corbière died in 1875. He is an important figure associated with this movement, that is symbolism, a broad term that occasionally extends to the early 20th century modernists like T.S. Eliot, then somebody like James Joyce, then Ezra Pound. Symbolism is traditionally dated roughly from 1870 to 1900. The term symbolism was coined by Jean Morris in the Review of La Vogue in 1886. This movement became more international in the 1890s with emergence of European symbolism such as the Russian symbolism, German symbolism, etc. And with such a poet such as Emily Nilin in Canada, and of equal importance is the influence as uh, tendencies related to scientific. Symbolism reacted to the broader cultural tendencies related to scientific and literary positivism, such as realism and naturalism, and the language of the popular praise, particularly as it appeared in the form of bestsellers, right? And where popular language informs the public with moral narratives, symbolist language tries to avoid such a reduction. And then we have got some literary concepts which are quite famous. Particularly one is catharsis, as we have seen already, the purification of soul through imitation. Then mimesis, again objective correlative by T.S. Eliot we have seen. Then we have seen ambiguity, and also now we are going to talk about negative capability. Now, what is negative capability? It is a term first used by English romantic poet John Keats. When we talked about romanticism, we talked about his negative capability, though he has not written much in detail about this, right? Is an 1817 letter. According to John Keats, negative capability is a writer's ability, which Shakespeare possessed so enormously, to accept uncertainties, mysteries, doubts without any irritable reaching after the fact and the reason. And so this remains very significant and important to understand that exactly. So an author, no, in a way, an author like possessing some negative capability is objective and emotionally detached, as opposed to one who writes for didactic purposes. So a literary work possessing negative capability may have a beauties and depths that make conventional considerations of truth and morality irrelevant. Exactly. So negative capability is something in a way can be applied like that. And so he contrasted this quality with writing of Coleridge, who would let go by a fine isolated verisimilitude from being incapable of remaining content with half knowledge, and went on express the general principle that with a great poet the sense of beauty overcomes ever, other considerations, or rather obliterates all considerations. In a way, negative capability works something like that. He says that it is an elusive term. It can be taken to characterize an impersonal or objective, an author who maintains aesthetic distance, as opposed to subjective author who is personally involved with characters and actions presented in a work of literature. And secondly, it says to suggest that when embodied in a beautiful art form, the literary subject matter concepts and characters are not the subject to the ordinary standards of evidence, truth, and morality. Like, and so this is how we conclude with our discussion on today's chapters about these various terminologies and movements that have started. So we talked about particularly classical movement, neoclassical movement, romantic movement, then naturalistic, structuralistic. Then we talked about various terminologies like a symbolism, naturalism, structuralism, exactly, and so many of the other which have been there, right? And this was all about the brief account of modern period, neocritical period, exactly. And with this, we conclude our discussion on various literary critical theories that we have been discussing so far, keeping the recent examination into our consideration. Moving forward, with this session, we have got some question answers which we are going to do in a detailed way, guys. Right? So let us move to understand those question answers. Now, in these question answers, I have prepared around 50 questions, and the subject matter of these questions is basically particularly on modern period, exactly covering various terminologies and ideas that got evolved in modern period of literary criticism. Right? And let's begin with the question answers of this period. The first topic is general modern criticism and the key thinkers of this very period. The question is, who is the author of Tradition and Individual Talent? I. Richards talked about Indian fallacy. T.S. Eliot definitely, F.R. Lewis and Clean's book. The answer is T.S. Eliot. Now the second question we have is, according to Eliot, the poet's mind should be in his traditional individual talent only we find him. Emotional center, no. Yes, he talked about catalyst, objective force, no, and abstract identity. No, it should be the catalyst. Yes, so the answer is catalyst. Moving to the third one we have is, who introduced the term practical criticism? It's Matthew Arnold, Kenneth Brooks, I.A. Richards, or D. Northrop. It's I.A. Richards people. Exactly. This term was greatly introduced by I.A. Richards. Right. Matthew Arnold is famous for the touchstone method. Kenneth Brooks famous for the ambiguity and instant fallacy. Then Northrop Fryer is definitely somebody who is quite famous for his naturalism. Now we have got here is I.A. Richards, who talked about practical criticism. Then the well brought on was written by Kenneth Brooks, F.R. Lewis, William Empson, or W.K. Wimsatt, and the answer is it is by Kenneth Brooks. Moving to that, we have got fifth question with us. The concept of intentional fallacy was proposed by, exactly, it was proposed by W.K. Wimsatt and M.C. Beardsley, neither T.S. Eliot, not I.A. Richards or F.R. Lewis, but it was greatly proposed by W.K. Wimsatt. Option A is the correct answer for question number 5. Moving forward, we have got this. Which critic is associated with practical criticism and 4 kinds of meanings? F.R. Lewis, I.A. Richards, Kenneth Brooks, or T.S. Eliot? Who talked about 4 kinds of meaning? Yes, the answer is I.A. Richards. In the treatise, he talked about that, right? Next question we have is, who wrote The Great Tradition in 1948? Matthew Arnold, no. T.S. Eliot, no. Northrop Fryer, no. It was talked by F.R. Lewis. The answer is F.R. Lewis. Option C. Question 8 we have, which says, the idea of organic unity, exactly, the idea of organic unity is central to deconstruction, new criticism, psychoanalytic criticism or structuralism? As structuralism, exactly no, it was quite familiar with new criticism, organic unity. Structuralism talked about the structure, psychoanalytic talked about the psyche, exactly deconstruction talked about the rules and avoiding all those things. So I've got new criticism with us. Moving forward, we have ninth question with us, and which says, which literary movement emphasizes close reading rather than the author's intention? New criticism, reader response, or structuralist, or feminism? It is definitely न्यू क्रिटिसिझम. या सगळ्या टर्म्स कुठे इंट्रोड्यूस केल्या गेल्या होत्या? न्यू क्रिटिसिझम मध्ये इंट्रोड्यूस केल्या गेलेल्या होत्या. We have got question number 10th with us, which says the 7 types of ambiguity is critical work by Cleanly Brooks. No, it was by William Emerson. Ambiguity बद्दल न्यू क्रिटिसिझम मधल्या कुठल्या क्रिटिकने बोललो होतं, तर तो होता डेफिनेटली तो कुठला क्रिटिक होता, तर तो होता विल्यम एम्पसन. राइट, आपण काल बघितलंय, in the previous lecture we have definitely talked about this very in a straight way. Moving to the 11th question we have now. This question covers structuralism, post-structuralism, and psychoanalytic criticism. Right, and who is considered the father of structuralism? Jacques Derrida, Ferdinand de Saussure, Michel Foucault, or Roland Barthes? It's not Roland Barthes or Michel Foucault. It is Ferdinand de Saussure. According to Saussure, language operates as a system of symbols and myths, signs and differences, emotions and feelings, or words and meanings. Now, he being the prominent structuralist, exactly, according to him, language operates as a system of signs and differences. 12th question we have is, of grammatology is a major work by, yes, Michel Foucault, Jacques Derrida, Roland Barthes, or Julia Kristeva? The answer is it's by Jacques Derrida. Jacques Derrida, I'm sorry. It's by Jacques Derrida. Question number 14 we have, which says, the term logocentrism is associated with Marxist criticism, new historism, deconstruction, or structuralism. Exactly, it is associated with deconstruction, logocentrism. Question number 15 we have, who introduced the concept of death of author? Not Jacques Derrida, not Roland Barthes, no Michel Foucault, Julia Kristeva. Exactly, it was by Roland Barthes. 16, question number 16 we have, Sigmund Freud's theory primarily focuses on social structure, on unconscious mind, linguistic codes, or political power. As Sigmund Freud was a famous psychologist, he must have talked about unconscious mind only. So option B is the correct option. Going to question number 17, we have, which of the following term associated with Jacques Lacan? Archetype, mirror stage, ideological state apparatus, or defamiliarization? It is mirror stage. Moving to question number 18. According to Lacan, the unconscious is structured like a poem, dream, or language, or myth. It is language. Let's repeat the question. What it says, according to Lacan, the unconscious is structured like a poem, a dream, a language, or myth. It is language. Discourse is a power is a central idea of Roland Barthes, Derrida, Michel Foucault, or Freire. Exactly, it was not by Northrop Frere, nor by Jacques Derrida or Roland Barthes, but it was by Michel Foucault. Julia Kristeva's critical approach combines structuralism and Marxism, psychoanalysis and feminism, Marxism and formalism, reader response and postmodernism. Exactly, option B, it approach combines psychoanalysis and feminism. Next question that covers feminist, Marxist, and reader response criticism. Who wrote A Room of One's Own? Simone de Beauvoir, exactly, Virginia Woolf, Julia Kristeva, or Ellen Schauer? Exactly, A Room of One's Own was written by Virginia Woolf. Genocriticism. Genocriticism is a term coined by Julia Kristeva, Helen Fuchs, Ellen Showalter, or option D, Torimua. It was Ellen Showalter. Genocriticism. Gynocriticism, or you can say genocriticism. Gynocriticism can be referred to that. Question number 23 we have. Then Simon de Beauvoir's The Second Sex was first published in 1949. Option C is the correct option, 1949. I hope I'm not speeding it, otherwise you can slow it down and watch again, right? Let's continue. Question number 24. The personal is political is a key slogan of which movement? And it is a feminism, people. Option C, option A, Marxism, post-structuralism, feminism, or formalism. Option C, it is a concept of feminism. Karl Marx, thus capital critics is capitalism, feudalism, socialism, or romanticism. Yes, it is capitalism. Which critics is most associated with Marxist literary theory? Northrop Frye, Raymond Williams, T.S. Eliot, or Emerson? It is Raymond Williams. Reader response theory places emphasis on author's intention, historic context, the reader's role in meaning making, and the structure of the text. Exactly, obviously, the answer says it is a reader response theory, the reader's role in meaning making. Stanley Fish is known for his work in feminist theory. No. New criticism. No. Reader response criticism. Yes. Marxist criticism. No. Option C is the correct option. Moving forward, we have Hans Robert Gist is associated with aesthetic of reception, psychoanalysis, archetypal criticism, or structuralism. Yes. Hans Robert is associated with aesthetic reception. Wolfgang Iser emphasized the role of the unconscious, the implied reader, the author, or the signifier. The implied reader. Moving forward, we have question number 30 now, which talks about archetypal criticism, new historicism, postcolonial and cultural criticism. ज्याच्याबद्दल आपण आता जस्ट बोललो या लेक्चर मध्ये. Northrop Frye is best known for his work in new criticism, archetypal criticism, or deconstruction or feminism. It is archetypal criticism. Anatomy of Criticism was published in 1957. The term New Historicism is associated with Stephen Greenblatt, F.R. Lewis, T.S. Eliot, or Stanley Fish. It is Stephen Greenblatt. Michel Foucault's approach inspired which critical movement? The question says Michel Foucault's approach inspired which critical movement? Marxism, deconstruction, new historicism, or feminism? It is new historicism. Question number 35. Post-colonial criticism is most prominently associated with Gayatri Spivak, Edward Said, Homi Bhabha, Derrida and Barthes, Eliot and Lewis, or Freud and Lacan. Option A. Gayatri Spivak, Edward Said, and Homi Bhabha. Question number 36. Edward Said's Orientalism critiques psychoanalysis, feminism, secularism, Western imperialism. It criticizes or covers the criticism of Western imperialism. Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak's famous essay is Can Subaltern Speak? Discipline and Punish of Grammatology or Culture and Imperialism. It is Can Subaltern Speak? Option A. Question number 38. Cultural materialism is associated with Raymond Williams and Jonathan Gallimore, T.S. Eliot, and Lewis. Cultural materialism, okay, is associated with Freud and Lacan. Kristeva and Seesaw. No, it is with Raymond Williams and Jonathan Leninov. Question number 39. Homi Bhabha's concept of hybridity deals with language structure, feminism, post-colonial identity, or psychoanalysis. Post-colonial identity. Which of the following critics is associated with cultural studies? Which of the following critics is associated with cultural studies? Roland Barthes, Stuart Hall, Derrida, or Lacan? It is Stuart Hall. Now moving to the next chapter, question number 41 to 50 are on postmodernism, eco-criticism, and contemporary theory. Let's go and try to understand the 10 questions that we have from this theory. Jean-Francois Lyotard defines postmodernism as the death of author incredulity toward meta-narratives, the return of the real, a new form of romanticism. Exactly, it is Jean-Francois Lyotard. Then it means option B, incredulity towards meta-narratives. Option B. And 42 we have is exactly Jean Baudrillard is famous for his concept of deconstruction, hyperreality, structuralism, or feminism. It is option B, hyperreality. Linda Hichon is associated with feminism. No. Postmodernism, yes. Marxism, no. Archetypal criticism, no. Option B for question number 43. Question number 44. The Order of Things is written by Jacques Derrida, Michel Foucault, Lyotard, or Roland Barthes. It is written by Michel Foucault. Foucault. Question number 45. Eco-criticism primarily focuses on political system, nature and environment in literature, language structure, or reader's role. Option B, nature and environment in literature. Question number 46. Lawrence Bill and Cheryl Glotfelty are associated with feminism, eco-criticism, postmodernism, or psychoanalysis. They are quite famous with eco-criticism. Question number 7 we have the anxiety of influence is critical work by Harold Bloom, F.R. Lewis, T.S. Eliot, or Raymond Williams. No, an anxiety of influence is by Harold Bloom. Moving further, we have another important is the term intertextuality was coined by Derrida, no. Roland Barthes, no. Julia Kristeva, yes. Michel Foucault, no. Not option A, B, D. It's option C, which is the correct option for this question. And question number 49 we have with us. Which of the following is not a characteristic of postmodern literary theory? Irony and playfulness, yes. Stable meaning, no. Fragmentation, yes. Pastiche, yes. Stable meaning is the correct option. And last question. The idea of reader as a producer of a meaning is central too. Yes, reader as a formalizer. Yes. So this idea is very particularly famous with which one? New criticism, reader response theory, structuralism, or Marxist criticism. Exactly. The right option is option B, reader response theory. Exactly. And so this was the complete overview of all the 50 questions defining various phases and periods in modern period of literary criticism, in which it covers talking about, right? So in our previous lectures, to revise what we have talked so far, is we have talked about some general moral critics and the key thinkers that existed in this period. Exactly. So that these 10 questions were based on them. Then we talked about the structuralism, post-structuralism, and psychoanalytic critics. So people like Jacques Derrida, Fernand de Saussure, Michel Foucault, Roland Barthes, Sigmund Freud, George Lacan, exactly, were the prominent figures, and some of the other people also about whom we talked in our those lecture series, right? Then we have covered questions that talk about prominently the upcoming figures that exist in the period is that the feminist approach, Marxist approach, then the reader response criticism, right? We talked about them and some prominent figures too. And moving forward, we also have talked about the archetypal or new historicism, then post-colonial and cultural criticism, right? Moving forward, lastly, we also have talked about some prominent figures and the critical theories that got greatly emerged, and also have discussed the questions based on them is postmodernism, eco-criticism, and contemporary theory, right? In which we have covered all the 50 questions so far. So people, this was all about our today's session. In our upcoming session we are going to continue with history of English literature from Romantic period. Particularly, this was about the critical theories, exactly, and the literary criticism that got evolved in the course of time, right? And now, yet there are some factors that we are supposed to go on discussing, right, when we are particularly talking about that, right? So let's bid adieu today. Let's say goodbye and conclude our today's session on this note. Exactly, this was